Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you are actually watching our session. Welcome. I'm happy to be with you today. Due to the situation, we can unfortunately not meet in person, but I hope you are comfortable from wherever you are watching us. I'm Laurence Levac, head of the Complaints Handling and Reporting Unit, working at the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg, and more particularly, the Complaints Mechanism of the European Investment Bank. The title of our session today is International Financial Institutions, or IFIs, and adoption of lessons learned through their accountability functions. A large number of international financial institutions, or IFIs, have established an independent accountability mechanism. And the network of independent accountability mechanism has actually grown over the years. But what is accountability about? I would like to share with you a short video that explains the work of the independent accountability mechanism at IFIs. Let's watch it.
In the 1990s, following calls for greater transparency and accountability in development projects, international financial institutions, or IFIs, began establishing independent accountability mechanisms to provide recourse for people who believe they have been or could be harmed by IFI-supported projects. In giving local communities a greater voice, these mechanisms, known as IAMs, reflect the principle of citizen-driven accountability and represent an innovation in global governance. Today, a large number of multilateral and bilateral financial institutions have mechanisms, and the network of IAMs is growing. While IAMs differ in size, scope, and structure, they share a common goal: to strengthen development outcomes by providing local communities an impartial, independent, and transparent channel to address social and environmental concerns. IAMs deliver on this goal through different services, among them dispute resolution related to project issues and investigations of an IFI's compliance with its environmental and social policies. IAMs accept complaints in different languages and work with communities to understand their concerns. Over time, IAMs have addressed a range of issues, including inadequate compensation for forced resettlement, destruction of culturally significant landscapes, insufficient engagement with local communities, environmental degradation, threats to community health and safety, and labour issues. In short, IAMs have helped improve the social and environmental performance of the IFIs and have contributed to better development outcomes for people, and through their work they contribute to the global community's broader commitment to sustainable and equitable development. Looking forward, communities will surely face challenges when projects cause unintended harm. IAMs reflect the important commitment of the IFIs to give people a voice when their rights and interests are affected, and to meet the highest standards of transparency and accountability. To learn more about the independent accountability mechanisms and their work, visit the IAMs Network website.
So the independent accountability mechanisms of IFIs have an important function. They provide a vehicle for people affected by the IFI's finance projects or activities to be heard. Too often, and unfortunately, the accountability mechanism is perceived as a policing or controlling function. And this can result in sometimes very difficult discussions and even challenging relationship within the institutions. But as explained in the video, the objective of the accountability function is really to ensure sustainable results and foster improvement. And this is precisely the topic of our session today. We would like to present to you some specific cases that were brought to the independent accountability mechanisms of 4 IFIs and that resulted in important learnings for those institutions and helped improve the way of doing business in IFIs. The 4 IFIs are the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank Group, and the European Investment Bank Group. And we have 8 speakers who are all great speakers and who will actually be presenting in pairs. So we'll have one representative from the accountability mechanism and one representative from the management, so from the IFI. And each pair will present specific cases and lessons learned in a different area. So we'll have in total 4 areas being covered. Now, for the inspection panel World Bank pair, we have Imrana Jalal, chairperson of the inspection panel, and Charles Di Leva, Chief Officer of Environmental and Social Standards, and they will be presenting lessons learned and responses in the area of gender-based violence in projects. For the EIB, European Investment Bank pair, Complaints Mechanism, and the institution, we have Sonja Derkum, who is heading the Complaints Mechanism, and Slađana Kosic, who is a Senior Social Development Specialist at the Projects Directorate. And they will be sharing with us common issues and lessons learned in the area of stakeholder engagement in projects. And actually their presentation and the presentation of the MISSI pair, so MISSI and the Inter-American Development Bank pair, are very complementary. For the MISSI and the Inter-American Development Bank pair, we have Andrea Repetto, who is the director of the Independent Consultation and Investigation Mechanism, so in short, MISSI, who will be talking on behalf of Joseph Mileski, chief of the Environmental and Social Solution Unit. And we have Arantxa Villanueva, compliance review coordinator of the same mechanism. And they will be taking a specific angle of stakeholder engagement, focusing on Indigenous peoples. Now, finally, for the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman and International Finance Corporation pair, we have Gina Barbieri, who manages the CEO's dispute resolution function, and Larissa Louis, who is manager of environmental and social risk and grievance response. And they will provide us with successful examples where a dispute resolution process was used to respond to complaints. Now, before we start with the presentations, I would like to draw your attention to something: the chat function. You can chat with us, and I would encourage you to do so. I know all our speakers are actually looking forward to interact with you. The session is pre-recorded, but I can guarantee you that the speakers will be watching the chat, particularly during the days of the conference. So please do not hesitate, use the chat function if you have any questions or you would like to share any thoughts. And with that brief introduction, let's get started. We will start with the first presentation from Imrana and Charles on gender-based violence in projects.
Hello, and welcome to this discussion titled Gender-Based Violence in Projects, Lessons and Responses at the World Bank. So my name is Imrana Jalal, and I'm the chair of the World Bank Inspection Panel. For those who may not know, the Inspection Panel is an independent complaints mechanism for people and communities who believe they have been or are likely to be harmed by a World Bank funded project. The inspection panel was created in 1993 to ensure that people have access to an independent body to which they can express their concerns and seek recourse. The form of recourse, or the remedy that is done by the World Bank, is in the form of a management action plan. The management action plan responds to the findings of harm that have been made by the inspection panels. Joining me today is Charles Di Leva, the World Bank's Chief Environmental and Social Standards Officer. Charles, thank you so much for participating. So Charles and I are going to talk today about a pair of groundbreaking panel investigations, one in Uganda in 2016 and the other 2 years later in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the DRC. And the really transformative effect that those 2 cases had on the World Bank as an institution. First, let me describe the cases and some of the key insights from them from the panel's perspective. And then after that, Charles will talk about the range of systemic and operational reforms the World Bank took to mitigate and prevent gender-based violence happening in future projects. The first case was the Uganda Transport Sector Development Project, and the second was the so-called Pro-Roots project in the DRC. So these two cases were the first to bring allegations of gender-based violence to the panel. In fact, they were the first cases ever amongst the independent accountability mechanisms of the international financial institutions to do so. So in both these cases, the inspection panel did the investigation using expertise like gender-based violence expertise, gender experts, and so on. And what they found was a whole range of harms that had been committed by project contractor employees. So it's important for you to know that the violence that was committed against women and girls was not committed by World Bank staff, but was committed by staff employed by the project contractor. And in the cases of both Uganda and the Congo, the the contractors, the staffing for the contractors were brought in both from abroad, so they were foreign workers, and also from other parts of Africa into Uganda and into the DRC. So what did the panel find in the course of its investigation? It found that the project had failed to do a proper gender assessment. It had failed to do a gender-based violence analysis, a proper gender diagnostics, because had a proper gender diagnostics been done, then they would have known what issues prevailed in the community where the project was being implemented, and the project could have designed appropriate responses to it. They found that there had been a lack of non-governmental organization input, NGO input. Had they, for example, consulted with a local women's NGO in the area, they might have been better informed about what could possibly occur when you're bringing in large numbers of male construction workers into the area. They found that because the project had failed to do this analysis, there were no mitigation measures. There was a lack of mitigation measures in project design. They also failed to do a very critical thing. They were bringing in hundreds and hundreds of male construction workers from both abroad and from other parts of Africa into an area that was already poor, in which there was already prevailing gender-based violence. So what could be expected to happen? Increased risk of gender-based violence. They also found that for the most part during the course of both projects, there either had been no grievance redress mechanism or an inadequate grievance redress mechanism. And finally, and most importantly, in both projects, the inspection panel found that there had not been appropriate supervision in the implementation of the project. So these were the findings, as you can see in the slide, in both cases. However, in addition, in the Congo complaint, the panel found that there had been a lack of understanding of the specific context of a fragile and conflict-affected area. So they found that the project did not look at the issue of the risks that would be posed in implementing a project in an FCV context, that the project had failed to analyze the risks associated with the presence of security forces, because in this case, the contractor used security forces, and in many cases, the gender-based violence was committed by members of the security force, and in other cases, the security force staff actually guarded the areas so that the employees of the contractor could actually commit the GBV. And of course, in many countries where there's a weak rule of law context, it is very difficult for girls and women to go to the justice agencies and complain about what happened to them because they don't have confidence in the justice system being able to respond to their concerns. So I just mentioned the issue of what are the consequences when you bring in large numbers of male workers into an area which is already poor. So Charles, given the situation that the panel found in both Uganda and the DRC in relation to the impact of the large labor influx into the project area, can you talk a little bit about how the bank responded to this particular issue? Because I know they responded very swiftly.
I think the response was indeed fortified by the important findings of the panel. And as you know, at the time that these projects were developed, it was prior to the new environmental and social framework becoming effective. One of the elements that the new ESF requires us to address is this issue of whether labor influx can pose a risk to community health or safety. This is present in the overall approach that we have to take on looking at environmental and social risks from having this influx of new, potentially, as you said, thousands of workers in a community, and the stress and strain it provides both to natural systems as well as the risk to women and girls. And we've developed a labor influx guidance material to help our staff address that particular issue. As well, the standards relate to community health and safety, labor and working conditions, occupational health and safety, and looking in standard 1 at risks of violence, both to communities and to individuals, is something we really didn't have under the old safeguard policies that were in place at the time these projects were developed. So I think the panel findings, dovetailing with the launch of the new ESF, should put us in a much better situation to deal with these kinds of very severe risks going forward.
Thank you, Charles. So all in all, the cases provided quite a few takeaways for the panel. And in addition to that, important lessons for the bank. So let me highlight a few of them. What we learned is the lack of a project-specific gender-based violence analysis or gender diagnostics means development comes at a significant human and gender-specific cost to women. So you have to look for the early warning signs of high risk of project-related gender-based violence. And these are low levels of gender equality, high rates of gender-based violence in the area already existing, an influx of male construction workers, poor law enforcement, impunity from prosecution for gender-based violence, and often a fragile conflict and violence-affected context. The results of the investigations and the changes that occurred at the World Bank have been covered in an advisory report on gender-based violence that the panel published in December 2020. It can be found on our website, and I encourage you all to read it. I think I'll stop there and hand over to Charles. Charles?
Thanks, Imrana. And as you quite rightly pointed out, we have had throughout our institution a comprehensive response to addressing gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And it comes through various levels. And the inspection panel report, of course, went to our board. And quite rightly, in their role, they asked management to find the ways to properly address this issue. As I said before, fortunately, the new environmental and social framework that became effective in the fall of 2018 gives us the tools when it comes to assessing environmental and social risk to identify and address and manage the measures to tackle sexual exploitation and abuse. Part of that was developing resources so that we would be able to respond. And that, of course, meant that the institution needed to bring on board experts through our gender group who could help advise us on how to tackle this issue, what kind of instruments we would need, and to provide critical training to our staff so that they understand the risks and how to address this. So far, we can say we've trained at least 1,500 bank staff who have taken a mandatory multi-hour course on understanding and addressing the risks to sexual exploitation and abuse. We have developed good practice tools that enable our staff to also risk rate different types of projects along our spectrum of high, substantial, moderate, and low risk rating to identify the types of support that we would need to bring to the borrowers so that they can implement action plans to deal with this particular risk. This also includes, and as you mentioned earlier, Imrana, the findings that you had was that the violence was perpetrated by the staff of contractors. So what we realized is this was not just an issue in terms of addressing through the EA and the environmental plan itself, but also making it incumbent on the contractors to be responsible for those staff. So in our civil works projects now, especially those that are of a significant size, we have a good practice tool that requires contractors to build in codes of conduct for which each contractor and all of their staff will be responsible, laying out the manner and means by which they need to behave in circumstances where GBV is at a risk. And moreover, the World Bank became the first international financial institution to put in place a system to disqualify for up to 2 years those contractors who fail to adhere to that code of conduct and in which we have these potential unfortunate cases of GBV. Moreover, under the new ESF, we require every single project to have a grievance redress mechanism at the project level. And that mechanism must be able to be equipped to handle potential cases of sexual exploitation and abuse if that's a risk in that particular project setting. And that applies not only to the community, but also if there are women in the workforce that need to have access to that kind of grievance mechanism. And as you pointed out, Imrana, the panel has, of course, insisted on strong protections for the confidentiality of people who raise these concerns. And we have done the same as a requirement in our grievance redress mechanisms as well, and for our bank staff to also be sure that these are handled appropriately so people are not afraid to come forward with these types of cases.
So before you go off, if I could ask you one more question, which is, there's always a gap between the introduction of policies and guidelines and so on and so forth, which are institutional, and then trying to change the mindsets of people. And I'm really happy to know that you've done training with such a large number of World Bank staff. That's really fantastic. But I'm curious about whether or not these really change the mindsets. So say, for example, task team leaders. Do you have any examples of situations where you really saw that there had been a significant attitudinal change in the task team leader's mind and how that affected how the project was designed?
Well, we have, and I think part of it is also because the task team leaders are aware that we have committed to report regularly to the board on how we are addressing sexual exploitation and abuse. And that includes detailing how the projects are being rated and what our staffing is to deal with that. And we've seen task team leaders now understand that the issues that you raised earlier, Imrana, are that these are not just questions of mitigating measures to protect the bank or its reputation. These are means to make the project successful, because we want to know that the communities in which we are operating welcome these development activities. The community is the stakeholder. And so if there is a threat of violence, if the stakeholders are not able to properly engage with the project, task team leaders understand that their project, as we saw in the projects that the panel investigated, those projects can be suspended. And then it's of no one's benefit. The road doesn't get built. The villages can't use the road to get to the hospitals or bring their produce to market. And so development itself can be terribly hindered by these kinds of situations of gender-based violence. And so the fact that from our board to our president to all of our vice presidents have embraced this agenda has truly filtered throughout the institution. And we are now, under the ESF, we have now instituted mandatory risk rating of projects going forward. And all of our supervision reports going forward will require the task team, and the task team leader is responsible for finalizing that supervision report, will require them to indicate the rating on SEA and that they have supervised that component if it is a risk in that particular project.
Thanks for reminding me, Charles. It's important for those listening in to know that in the case of the Uganda project, the World Bank cancelled the project. And in the case of the DRC, when the harms were manifested, the World Bank suspended the project, and only after it was brought back into compliance in terms of environmental and social safeguards was the project reinstated.
That's right, but it's also that they approved it after we developed the management action plan, which the panel, of course, was very familiar with. And that action plan was probably the most extensive action plan of any panel case we had before. One of the things that it developed was an educational tool for the project to require be shared with all of the workers in the community. And I think one of the things that we wanted to show our audience was one of those very simple educational tools that we had developed for the contractors to share and require, frankly, as part of the learning for their staff, to understand how to try to interact with the women and girls in the community. So there were many actions that we developed in response to the panel's investigation, and we reported on those to the board, and those actions had to be fulfilled in order for us to lift the suspension, as you point out, and for that project to eventually be able to be completed.
I think we've come to the end of our time. Charles, thanks again for this discussion. We hope that all of you who have viewed it have found it helpful. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat box and we'll try to respond to them. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of this conference.
Thanks, Imrana and Charles, for your very good presentation on gender-based violence in development projects. Now, let's give the floor to the European Investment Bank pair, who will be presenting cases and lessons learned in the area of stakeholder engagement in projects.
Good day and welcome to all of you out there from wherever you are joining. We are connecting today from Luxembourg. My name is Sonja Derkom and I'm heading the European Investment Bank Complaints Mechanism. It's the accountability mechanism of the bank. In short, we also call it the CM. I'm joined today by Slađa Ćosić, who is a senior social development specialist. She is the lead on stakeholder engagement at project level in the EIB's Environment, Climate and Social Office. We will be talking about stakeholder engagement today. And I was wondering, what is the best way of introducing this on our side? Maybe it's worthwhile to provide you with a bit of background to our mechanism. The EIB Group Complaints Mechanism was established in 2008, and it has handled a large amount of cases since. I looked up the figures recently, and we handled something like 660 cases in total over the years, of which about 41% are environment and or social matters. In our jargon, the so-called E-cases. This is very relevant to our topic today. In many of these E-cases, there is one issue coming up again and again, and that's the lack of an effective stakeholder engagement. And this is our topic today. I would like to provide you with two examples of concrete cases, one being inside the EU and one outside. For my first example, the underlying project was one of an underground gas storage off the coast of Spain. This has been a very complex case with a range of allegations. They related to environmental and social impacts of the project, as well as the way the public consultation was carried out. In our analysis, we focused on the procedures applied for the public consultation carried out, which was criticized by the complainant at the time. As we all know, there is a regulatory framework around stakeholder engagement, and information and consultation are rather well codified in relevant EU directives. Also in this case, we concluded that all public consultation processes of this complex project were carried out in accordance with Spanish law. But still, when taking a closer look, there were issues surfacing. We noted that related to environmental matters, for example, concerning the exploitation concession was made available to the public. This took place during the 20 calendar days prescribed in the regulations, and it included Saturdays, although it's worth mentioning that on Saturdays, the premises were closed to the public. Furthermore, this happened during a holiday period, so in Spain in the month of August, and furthermore in premises located 80 kilometers away from the project site. This procedure was challenged by the public and the complainant in terms of both timing and location of documents. An announcement was published in the Spanish official journal, which opened a public participation procedure for 5 administrative procedures. The 5 procedures involved the review of more than 2,000 pages of documents on different technical subjects in different venues. So what we were faced with here were factors relating to public consultation that appear to be in conflict with the guidance provided by the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee. In terms of 2 things. Firstly, reasonable timeframes, and second, availability of the documents in places close to the affected local population. And we came up with a set of suggestions for improvement going forward. We asked the bank to improve guidance on how to assess the meaningfulness of the public consultation process. And this guidance was also to be based on the implementation and best practices, including those of the relevant Aarhus Convention bodies. More risk-driven guidance for the bank on the stakeholder engagement process and its results was also suggested. So the bank was encouraged to verify that the concerns and risks flagged as part of the stakeholder engagement process were adequately assessed and addressed by the promoter. So this was our example from within the EU. The second example is from a wind farm project outside the EU in a rather remote area, and the complaint arrived from a village nearby. We gathered during our review that the public was informed about the project as envisaged in the related communication plan. However, a session held to inform the stakeholders was held in a distance from the project site, with villagers either not being aware of this and or also the location of the exchange being too far away for them to reach it. The session was attended by administration-appointed representatives for the communities. However, there were issues with the legitimacy of the representation, as the villagers would have rather appointed their local chiefs had they been faced with the question. The promoter made up for some of these shortcomings during our review, so at a later stage, with specific information campaigns. However, we noted that the information process did not allow for the submission of any opinion from the affected communities. So Ultimately, we perceived this was a one-way street. Finally, we had to conclude that the stakeholder engagement did not effectively reach the entire community, and agreed with the bank's services that they prepare an action plan to identify and monitor concrete measures to ensure effective information sharing and consultation on this project going forward. So these were my two examples, and although I could have mentioned others, at this point I would like to hand over to Slaja, who will talk you through how the bank took on board our suggestions, and in particular, how it provided guidance on stakeholder engagement. Over to you, Slaja.
Thank you, Sonia, and greetings to everybody listening. I am part of the team that is responsible for policy development in the area of environment, social, and climate change at the European Investment Bank. So this also includes development of environmental, climate, and social policy and standards, as well as support for their implementation and mainstreaming throughout the bank's activities. At the operational level, the policies related to information disclosure, consultation and participation, and access to remedy are translated to EIB's standard on stakeholder engagement, which is a cross-cutting standard and which affirms the EIB's expectation that promoters uphold an open, transparent, and accountable dialogue with relevant stakeholders affected by EIB operations. EIB also has procedures and processes for due diligence related to compliance with the environmental and social standards, including on stakeholder engagement in EIB operations. So following the recommendation from the EIB's complaints mechanism, EIB enhanced guidance for EIB staff in the area of stakeholder engagement, as well as it developed an accompanying thematic guidance to provide good practice recommendations to EIB clients on how to meet the EIB's requirements regarding stakeholder engagement in EIB operations. The guidance is intended to be useful for project-affected persons, communities, civil society organizations, and government agencies and other parties interested in EIB-supported projects. So this guidance note is available on the EIB's external website. So what is the note about? In line with the complaints mechanism's conclusions, the guidance attempted to also provide additional guidance and examples of good practice on when consultations can be considered meaningful. Inclusivity, timing, adequate resourcing, as well as establishment of a broad community support have been highlighted in particular. The key principle being of proportionality. This means that the intensity and the scope of the consultations will depend on the environmental and social risks and impacts of the project. So, for example, in projects where environmental and social impacts and risks are identified as significant, the consultation should start as early as possible and continue throughout the project cycle, as dictated by the evolving risks, complexity, and stakeholder rights and interests in the project. So the consultations should start and be at its most intensive during the project preparation stages to provide, in particular, information for the environmental and social impact assessment and other project assessments or planning documents required. The consultation should start as early as possible while the public authorities are still at the information gathering and processing stage. Each phase of planned consultation should include reasonable periods to allow the public adequate time to digest the notification and the relevant information provided about the proposed project and prepare their feedback. In terms of inclusivity, for example, the process should include all those identified by the stakeholder analysis. It is particularly important that clients hear, understand, and address the concerns of vulnerable and marginalized groups, including in many contexts, women and youth. Inclusivity is essential and as is avoiding elite capture, in which the voices of politically, economically stronger and typically male stakeholders are predominantly heard. Furthermore, what is often underestimated is that effective consultations take time and cost money. The required budget depends on various factors, including relative prices and salary levels in the country, the complexity of the consultation process required, the diversity and geographic spread of stakeholders, any history regarding similar projects in the country, and the likelihood of needing an iterative approach with stakeholders. Such needs should be assessed at the outset to ensure that the consultation is adequately costed in the project budget and integrated in the project schedule. Finally, stakeholder engagement should result in broad community support for the project, which is understood as a collection of expressions by the affected communities through individuals and their legitimate representatives in support of the project. The guidance further clarifies that to achieve this, clients should demonstrate that they have listened to stakeholders' concerns and have sought to accommodate these concerns by modifying the project design and/or introducing mitigation measures. Importantly, a public record of the consultation process should summarize suggestions and concerns from stakeholders, stating which of these have been taken on board, as well as which ones the client is unable to accommodate, giving due reasons. To accompany the rollout of the new guidance and further strengthen EIB team's capacity to appraise quality of stakeholder engagement in EIB financed operations, a tailored internal training on this topic has been developed and is being offered to project teams on regular basis since last year. Over to you, Sonia.
Thanks a lot for this overview, Slađa. If you allow me to dig a little bit further, in terms of specific guidance to clients, how do you support them in making sure that the stakeholder engagement process is in an appropriate location?
Well, indeed, this is often an issue and a challenge both for EIB clients and affected communities, and the guidance tries to provide some further interpretation of our standards on this and clarifies that, for example, active information dissemination entails targeted measures to ensure that appropriate information reaches all key stakeholders so that the consultation can be informed and meaningful. This also requires the information to be in a language style format appropriate for the stakeholders in question and to be timely, accurate, and comprehensive about the issues that should be in the public domain. It also means ensuring it is easy for stakeholders to attend meetings, such as by holding them at locations convenient to them, giving adequate time and notice of events and timing them appropriately. For example, avoiding holidays, harvest time, or busy work periods, including times of the day when women are typically busy. So these are some of the very practical pointers that are included in the guidance note and that try to give flavor of some of the good practices that are out there and that should contribute to the improvement of the quality of stakeholder engagement in EIB financed operations.
Thanks a lot, Slađa. Very, very insightful indeed. Maybe to all of you out there, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We're happy to get back to you on these. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Sonia and Slađana, for this very insightful presentation on what a meaningful stakeholder engagement process would look like or should entail. And now let's go over to the next presentation, which also covers stakeholder engagement, but from a slightly different angle, focusing on Indigenous peoples. We have the MISI and Inter-American Development Bank pair presenting on Indigenous peoples.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the session. My name is Andrea Repeto, and I am the Director for the Independent Consultation and Investigation Mechanism of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. Our acronym follows our name in Spanish, and our mechanism is known as MISI. I'm here today with my dear colleague, Arantxa Villanueva, MISI's Compliance Coordinator. For those that don't know much about MISI, let me just share briefly who we are and what we do. So MISI is the independent accountability mechanism of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. For the past 10 years, the MISI process has been activated by complainants from affected communities in the Latin American and Caribbean region related to IDB-funded projects, be it public or private sector, to address the alleged harm. As per policy, MISI can deal with complaints in two ways: through our dispute resolution or compliance review. Through compliance review, the MISI seeks to ensure that the bank has complied with environmental and social safeguards framework under which all its operations must be structured. Compliance review findings and recommendations have great potential of institutional learning. In this session, MISI will speak to a particular case example to present findings in regard to stakeholder engagement and Indigenous people. The main objective is to illustrate how lessons learned have impacted the way of doing business by the Inter-American Development Bank and have served to strengthen the environmental and social safeguards capacity of the bank beyond this particular operation. The presentation will focus on those lessons and the transformative nature a compliance review can have. So we're going to distribute the session by having Arantxa present the case for us and discuss the findings and its recommendations. Afterwards, I'm going to share the lessons learned from IDB management. Unfortunately, they couldn't join us to this session today due to their availability, but they were happy to send us some slides with the lessons learned regarding this case. So without further ado, Arantxa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity today to present an overview of one of MISI compliance review cases. My name is Arantxa Villanueva. I'm the coordinator of the compliance review phase at MISI, and I'm going to present the Mareña Renovables wind power project in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, a region that has some of the best wind energy resources in the world, but also the land where different indigenous communities live. At the time of the approval of this project, it was the largest wind energy project to be developed in the Latin American region. MISI received a complaint regarding this project in 2012 by a representative of more than 200 members of 7 communities of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Those communities were indigenous communities. The complainants in the case allege harm to their traditional culture and their way of life as a consequence of the planning, construction, and the future operation of the project in different aspects. Among those aspects, they focused on environmental and biodiversity impacts, harm to their lifestyle as indigenous communities and to their traditional livelihood of fishing. One of particular aspects in this case is that those indigenous communities are one of the few in Mexico whose fundamental means of subsistence is fishing. They consider that it would be irreversibly affected by transmission lines running under the lagoons where they used to fish. They also allege lack of adequate public consultation and banks' failure to request an evaluation of the adverse impacts on the indigenous communities, but also its failure to consider the same communities as potential beneficiaries of the project to be developing their lands. In this case, MISI had some conclusions and findings on different issues. I'm going to refer to the main ones. One of them is the lack of ensuring appropriate conditions for meaningful consultation, and thereby impeding agreements based on good faith processes. In this case, the environmental impact assessments were not available at the time the usufruct contracts were negotiated with the communities for the use of land for the project. And even though the bank identified this issue during the due diligence and asked the client to engage in consultation with the potential affected communities, those processes didn't comply with the safeguards of the bank. Another main finding in this case is related to access to information. MISI found insufficient disclosure of project information, including project scope, as well as social impact assessment and mitigation plans. In particularly, of a total of 22 environmental impact assessments and documents that constituted the environmental and social framework of this project, only 5 of them were available to communities or were disclosed. There was also findings on lack of culturally appropriate consultation activities. So in spite of the indigenous nature of the communities, the information provided was not presented in culturally appropriate formats, specifically language, disclosure methods, and also time provided for consideration of communities. There is also findings on the exclusion of some of the affected people. So contacts were centered on agrarian community leaders, excluding other members of the communities, and in contravention of the communal decision-making structure of the indigenous peoples. Back to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Arantxa. Well, let's go through over what did the institution learn as provided by themselves. I just want to take a moment just to thank Joseph Mileski. He's the unit chief of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank. He produced the slides for us today, so thank you very much, Joseph, for doing that. And I'll just speak to the slides as instructed and shared with us by Joseph. So let's talk a little bit about the changes to ESG. So ESG restructures support to operations, functions of ESG particularly. They added a social practice leader. They recruited additional social specialists to the unit, and the unit was renamed to Environmental and Social Safeguards Unit. So the second slide talks about the thematic focus on social impacts and risk, and specifically the lessons learned and the management actions that they took in response to the Mareña case, as explained by Arantxa. The 2 big things that sort of were done in the context of the case was the development of 2 technical notes to strengthen IDB's practice in the area of social safeguards. They were used in trainings and workshops in the region. And one of them being meaningful stakeholder engagement, and the second one being social impact assessment. They also did a preliminary gap analysis of IDB's Indigenous People policy, which was conducted in 2017. And it was now updated in the new environmental and social policy framework, which will be in place entering into effect this year, 2021. Here is some of the knowledge and learning that ESG shared with us, particularly coming from the Mareña case. We had the proactive efforts are needed to identify contextual risk more systematically and prevent projects from contributing or exacerbating social conflict. Timely and accessible and culturally appropriate consultations and information disclosure are conditions for meaningful stakeholder engagement. Number 3, the need to systemically disclose all documents as required by the Operational Policy 102 in a timely manner. Supplemental studies should also be disclosed in a timely manner. Number 4, adequate assessment of cultural identity, costumes, and integrity being fundamental to ensuring that appropriate measures are taken to mitigate impacts to the cultural integrity of Indigenous groups. Good faith negotiation is built on full, timely, and culturally appropriate information, disclosure, and consultation processes in accordance with the community decision-making process and the participation of legitimate representatives. On the next slide, so modifications to information systems, changes in internal processes and procedures for ensuring that the applicable environmental and social documentation is disclosed. So there's a new convergence functionality in place since July 2017 for IDB, and an automated step has been incorporated as well in IDB's Invest project management platform in 2018. So the new environmental and social policy framework, many of these improvements that were discussed and learned as a result of the Maranhão case made it possible to implement the new environmental and social policy framework, which will enter effectiveness in late 2021. So yeah, I just want to thank again the Environmental and Social Unit Chief for sharing with us these lessons learned and for us to be able to present on their behalf today. I think this is a great example of how an opportunity that came from this case provided the IDB's environmental and social safeguard policies to be strengthened and to strengthen particularly issues related to stakeholder engagement, access to information, and Indigenous people. I also want to take the opportunity to thank very much Arantxa Villanueva for her contribution to this session and for sharing all the knowledge related to the case. And also to all of you for listening and being attentive. And we're happy to answer questions if you have for us or any observation and comment you might have related to our processes and the case. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea and Arantxa, for this very insightful presentation on the Maranhão case and issues related to meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples. And now let's go over to our last presentation, the presentation from the CEO, International Finance Corporation pair, and they will be talking or sharing with us some successful cases where a dispute resolution process was used.
Okay, welcome everybody. Lovely to be joining you today. I'm joined with my colleague Larissa Louis, who is from the International Finance Corporation. And we are going to be focusing on the use of dispute resolution or collaborative problem solving to address issues that are raised about development projects. My name is Gina Barbieri. I manage the dispute resolution function for the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman at the IFC. We are the independent mechanism for IFC and MEGA. Larissa Louis, welcome. And do you want to please introduce yourself too?
Hi, Gina, and welcome everyone to this session. I am Larissa Louis. I am the manager for environmental and social risk and grievance response at IFC. And we are responsible for the ENS risk oversight of IFC projects and also to respond to stakeholder grievances directly. And as Gina was mentioning, it's just to try to solve problems that are happening in our projects and be more effective at providing the best for our stakeholders.
And so our focus, as we've said today, is on dispute resolution. For those of you who perhaps don't know much about the accountability world, just very briefly, we, the CAO, the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, is the independent accountability mechanism for the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, and MEGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, both units part of the World Bank Group. Our mandate is to respond to complaints from communities who believe they are being negatively impacted, either environmentally or socially, by World Bank financed projects. And in responding to those complaints, our primary effort is focused on resolving the issues raised in the complaint and improving the environmental and social performance of the project. We're going to be focusing today on one of the tools we use in responding to the complaints, and that's dispute resolution. And I want to give you a little sense of what, when I say dispute resolution, we actually mean. What typically is happening in a dispute resolution process is a bringing together of the complainant or the community who have complained about the project, who believe they are being negatively impacted, and the private sector client, IFC or MEGA's private sector client, in a collaborative process that is designed by the parties to try and resolve the issues that are being raised in the complaint. And that's the primary focus of dispute resolution. We use a number of tools to achieve the outcomes that we're seeking. And I would say that two of the most important outcomes from our dispute resolution work is that trust between the host communities or the communities being impacted and the IFC MEGA client is greatly enhanced and improved through engagement in this process. And we'll talk about how we do that and some of the tools we're using. But right now, just to focus our attention on trust as an outcome, and then the capacity building that takes place for both the private sector client and the community to better understand what is the most effective and efficient way to engage with each other as very different stakeholders in trying to address these issues. So those are two of the primary outcomes that we see from our work. And Larissa, you've been involved in a number of projects where CAO has also been engaged. What do you see as being some of the value in using collaborative problem solving or dispute resolution?
So Gina, I would like to highlight, I think, one very specific point just overall in the accountability mechanism is that for IFC, having a strong and independent accountability mechanism helps us as an institution to improve our development mandate at the end by becoming aware of the issues and also finding innovative ways of solving these issues at a systemic point of view, and also at the project level, which is really what our stakeholders and the communities where our projects are want. So on the 2 points that you raised, so the building relationships and trust, I think what we have seen in several of the projects is that building this trust between the project and the project stakeholders really on the ground is one of these lasting, let's say, results or positive impacts of the DR process. And it improves overall how the project, how the client is perceived by communities, how the client can also solve problems, not only the problem which was the issue of the complaint, but how problems can be solved going forward, because that trust between the two key stakeholders has been built. So we find that, and we have several examples, as you said, we found that as a benefit of the DR process. Also, the capacity building part, I think the way on how you do the DR process also helps clients that might be really or two parties that might be in totally different opposite points at the beginning of the DR process. You see how they more and more begin to understand the other side and begin to reflect and say, okay, yes, maybe they have a point. Maybe I should also think about different ways of how to address things. So seeing that process and how they come together, and then in a collaborative manner, they can solve something that we thought at the beginning was totally unsolvable. And we have several, as you know, several places when we said, Gina, this is impossible. We will never be able to solve this. But I think those 2 points have been very effective when we have used the DR process.
That's great, Larissa. And just your comment about, sometimes these things appear so intractable and so unresolvable, and yet in some instances, they are being resolved. And it then prompts me to think about, well, how is it possible? How do we move parties who are so entrenched in positions and so far apart in terms of how they view a situation? How do we then start building that trust? So I want to talk about 3 tools that we use and share with you some examples of the use of those tools. And the first would be the use of an independent mediator. So you often find that those parties, when they are so firm on their views, it's very difficult for them to be willing to listen to the other side directly, because often they've either tried that or the relationship is so hostile and there's a lot of animosity and there's a lot of mistrust that everything they hear from the other side, whether it's the client listening to the community or vice versa, they don't believe what they're being told. And they have a perception that the information is not valid. It's not objective enough. And so bringing in an independent mediator to help the parties have those initial conversations and then jointly design the process, the tool that they're going to use, is incredibly helpful in those kinds of situations. And when I talk about independent mediators, what I'm actually meaning is individuals who have no vested interest in the outcome of the dispute. They don't represent the client, they don't represent the community. They're coming in to really help the client and the community actually have robust conversations about the issues, but in a way that helps them to remain focused on finding collaborative solutions to the problem. So that, I would say, is a very useful tool that we're using in many, many of our cases. And another tool that we're seeing more use of is what we've called joint fact-finding. So Larissa, as you know, in a lot of these projects, there is a dispute of fact. You know, for instance, in Mongolia, there was a dispute between nomadic herders and the IFC client around the impacts to the supply of water from the mining activities. And both parties had done their own homework, and the client had certainly spent some resources in trying to answer this question meaningfully. But there wasn't a process in which either side's information was enabling the other side to change their view, or to at least come to a common understanding of the issues and indeed the impacts that were going to be realized as a result of the project. And so through using a joint fact-finding process, we actually, with an independent mediator and mediation team, were able to help the herders and the client design a joint fact-finding process which saw them jointly selecting the experts that they would use, jointly designing the terms of reference for those experts, and then coming to a common understanding about what they would do with the results of the report. And there's a lot of information on CEO's website about the case in Mongolia, about the Oitogo mine, and you can go on online and see more information for those who are interested. And then lastly, another tool that we've seen both use in resolving issues, but then as an outcome from the dispute resolution work, are these joint development forums. And I mean, that sounds, you know, we've added a title to something that can be very, very informal, but it is a way of developing platforms where the community and the client are actually coming together to decide what are the development needs of the community. So in some instances, we often see clients, for example, in the kind of the golden years of corporate social responsibility, a lot of clients would say, well, you know, as long as we invest in the community and we think they need a soccer stadium, so up would go the soccer stadium. And 3 years later, nobody was playing soccer in the stadium. We're trying to get better at ensuring that communities have a voice in designing what that development program looks like. So Larissa, back to you. And you know, does any of that resonate with you, or can you share from the institution's perspective once again, what are some of the lessons perhaps or experiences you've had in this regard?
So Gina, yeah, it is clear, and now that I'm hearing to you, it is clear that the resolution of a grievance and a complaint really should happen as close as possible to the ground. And I think that's what you have highlighted. It's not happening in DC, it's not happening somewhere. It's really there at the project level with the complainants and all the stakeholders that need that are key to solve the problem. So one of the mediation, I've been in several of the mediation processes that you carry out. They are excellent. They are top of professionals, and they really, as you said, they are independent. They have no vested interest. So I think that is key, that they have no vested interest. They are acknowledged by both parties as being somebody that could help them to reach a solution. And then the second point, which also, or the second tool, which you mentioned, which is the fact-finding. I think you cannot contest facts. So I think maybe, for example, the client might have the perception that they are very good citizens, they have performance awards and everything, but then when they are confronted with facts, then it's very difficult to say, no, but I thought something different. So I think that has helped a lot, because a lot of our clients want to know, okay, it's not a perception of somebody, but it's really based on a complaint is based on facts. So that's extremely important. And I think something that it's also has resonated a lot with clients and also with us has been the collaborative monitoring going forward. So how we monitor in a collaborative manner clients and, let's say, complainants if we are really meeting the goals that were agreed as part of the DR process.
From our perspective as the independent mechanism, I think what we've learned over the years it being in operation is the importance of giving communities the rights of choice and really respecting their ability to choose how best they would like to have their problems resolved. And I think, certainly there are different tools at their disposal. And the complaints mechanism that I belong to, the CAO, is one tool, but there are many other tools that communities should be aware of and should have the ability to access if they feel that that's an appropriate mechanism. And then secondly, I think the other thing that we have to recognize is that, unfortunately, the real world doesn't enable us to only focus on facts. We often are dealing with perceptions. Mm-hmm. And I think it's perceptions of fact, it's perceptions of personnel, of the people involved. And some of the process tools that we've spoken about today really are providing avenues for us to perhaps move away from only the perceptions of situations to really understanding what is going on.
Yeah, great that you raised that, Gina, because that is true. In some cases, you have a lot of emotion, years of perceptions and years of community thinking that the companies were doing something wrongly or so. Another point that you raised was about IFC and how we have the new approach that we have is that we need to be more proactive. And we realize that addressing grievances is not something linear, and that in reality, a project affected person may not always want to have the availability or avenues to pursue their claims for a variety of reasons. And it could be that at the project level, the grievance mechanism is not working. It could be also that there is a weak national judicial system that is not trusted by the complainant, so they cannot do the normal complaint, which might happen in any other country. And also because of fears of retaliation. So there are some projects where we operate where these are projects of national importance. So any complaint against those projects might be seen as like going against something that is of national importance for the country. So there are several ways of a complainant. So the complainant should have all the avenues to be able to file a complaint. So therefore, IFC may not always be aware of some of the problems and issues in a project because they don't come directly to us. They will maybe come to you first rather than to us. But we are now we have established the grievance response team, which is now fully staffed, and we have implemented the systems and the procedures to be able to also receive complaints. So if a complainant wants to come directly to IFC, we are open. There is a team that can deal with that, and then in the same manner as trying to solve the problems, we will engage with that complainant and try to solve problems and raise it also with clients to ensure that the outcomes at the end are beneficial for everyone.
I think for me, two parting thoughts to leave would be, firstly, is just being mindful of the use of this mindset of collaborative problem solving, rather than doing it unilaterally or being contracted by the client to go out there and do your fact finding and not think through ways that you could actually bring the community voice in early and engage with those community members meaningfully as you advise your clients. So I think that was really helpful, hearing how IFC itself is picking up the baton, if you like, around using this as a tool. And then secondly, one thing we haven't touched on, but it did strike me as you were talking, Larissa, there's a lot of resources that both IFC and the CAO have available on our websites for impact assessors to use. And the one that I wanted to mention from CAO is our gender guidance note, because I think what we are engaging with now is the realization that to not be mindful of gender inclusivity in stakeholder engagement processes can actually do harm. So I would urge listeners to watch out for tools around how to deal with gender, how to deal with threats and reprisals that you mentioned, Larissa, as they go out to engage with communities and clients navigating the environmental and social impact space.
There are several tools in IFC's website. We have from the performance standards to the guidance notes to the EHS guidelines, and also good practice notes. And the latest one is one in collaboration with IDB, which is on retaliation, which is one that is really coming more and more in several of the projects. We are also updating our labor handbook, because labor conditions and the overall working environment is also something that is more and more present in the complaints that we receive from our projects. So please watch the space. There is a lot of information there that could be useful for all the participants.
Excellent. So thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you found that interesting. Larissa, it was lovely to be chatting to you today. For anybody who has any questions for us, please feel free to use the chat and we will navigate those as best we can. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. We hope you have found the 4 presentations useful and that they helped you get a better understanding of what accountability is about and how it can add value to the institutions and help actually improve the environmental and social performance of the projects that they finance. The gender-based violence cases presented by Imrana and Charles in fact resulted in lessons learned and changes not only for the World Bank, but far beyond. Many IFIs financing infrastructure projects started to take measures and actions to better assess and mitigate the risks of gender-based violence in development projects. At first sight, the 4 topics presented at this session appear to be quite different, but in fact, there are overlaps. Imrana and Charles referred to the importance of having effective and representative grievance redress mechanisms in place at project level, as these would have helped identify problems from the very onset. The establishment of grievance redress mechanism constitutes an integral part of an effective stakeholder engagement process, providing an appropriate avenue to continue engaging with project-affected people and other key stakeholders. A meaningful stakeholder engagement in general and consultation and engagement in good faith with Indigenous peoples are critical to ensure sustainable results. As the presentations of Sonia and Sajana and Andrea and Arantxa have shown, it is not sufficient to tick the box. Consultations need to be meaningful. There are many challenges, and speakers provided examples of some of these challenges, and providing concrete guidance in the area is very important. Finally, we have also seen with Gina and Larissa's presentation that a collaborative problem-solving approach can be instrumental in enhancing dialogue and information sharing between the affected communities and the institution's clients, and in institutional learning too, while at the same time resolving the issues raised in the complaints. So that concludes our session. I hope you enjoyed it. We were not able to meet you, but we really hope to see many of you on the chat. From our side, we will be keeping a very close eye on the chat and the questions and thoughts that you are sharing with us. You can also get in touch with the speakers by email. You will find their email address on each of the introductory slides of the 4 presentations. I would like to thank you for your interest in our session, but I would also like to thank the 8 speakers who were here to share their experiences and insights with us today. With this, I will say goodbye. Have a great day, and please do keep safe from wherever you are.